Welcome to the Real Python Podcast. This is episode 101. There are many ways to get Python installed on your computer. If you're going to start fresh, what tools would you use? What if you need to manage multiple versions of Python and virtual environments? What about all the additional tools that make your coding workflow complete? This week on the show, Calvin Hendryx-Parker is here to talk about bootstrapping your Python environment. Calvin is co-founder and CTO of 6 Feet Up and is the Python Web Conference co-organizer. As a consultant, Calvin has set up countless machines to run Python. He configures environments that can scale from in-office projects to distributed cloud-based applications. We cover tools for installing Python, managing multiple language versions, and configuring virtual environments. Calvin talks about setting up command line applications in isolated environments. We also discuss traveling with Python using an iPad. This episode is brought to you by ScoutAPM, built for developers by developers. All right, let's get started. The Real Python Podcast is a weekly conversation about using Python in the real world. My name is Christopher Bailey, your host. Each week, we feature interviews with experts in the community and discussions about the topics, articles, and courses found at realpython.com. After the podcast, join us and learn real-world Python skills with a community of experts at realpython.com. Hey, Calvin, welcome back to the show.
It's great to be here.
You guys reached out and wanted to talk, and I thought of an interesting topic for us that I kind of went through your YouTube history, and I looked at, kind of the past 3 years, and I thought about getting Python installed and things you need to think about there. And you had a lot of great advice in the videos, and so I wanted to kind of leverage that, and then we can kind of get into more intermediate and advanced things maybe near the end, and then the one extra thing that you did a thing about kind of Road Warrior and using Python on an iPad. And David Amos wrote an article recently that I'm going to link to also. And I thought we could talk about that too, because I'm very interested in that. So lots of mini topics, I guess, that we're going to combine together.
Oh, yeah. You dug deep for 3 years worth of content there.
Yeah, it was cool, though. It was kind of fun. You do a lot of talks in Indianapolis at IndyPy.
Yeah, so I'm actually one of the co-founders of the Indianapolis Python user group IndyPy, and we've been running that. Actually, this year is our 15th year running IndyPy. So we're celebrating with a nice anniversary party this year. I think that's coming up here in April or May.
Oh, cool.
So if you're in the Indy area and wanted to come by for that meeting, we're going to have, probably a big cookout and some cake to celebrate 15 years.
All right. That's awesome.
Yeah.
So a couple of talks were from that, and then there was a Django conference talk. But maybe I'll start with the first one, which I really liked the title of it. It was half a dozen ways to fail at Python.
Yeah, it's so accurate.
Yeah, I think there's still maybe even more potentially.
Right.
But we could focus on that. So what was the gist of the talk? What were you trying to get across?
I mean, it's so interesting with Python being a language that's easy for beginners to get started with and powerful enough for advanced people to do real work. It's still hard to know how to get your system bootstrapped. And a lot of things I talked about in that how to fail, which I've actually kind of refined over the years in a couple of other talks you just mentioned, was really, given your use case circumstance, how do you keep your machine from looking like that XKCD, super fun site cartoon that I think I've linked to in all of these talks, because it's so true. I mean, I have ended up in that spot.
Yeah, I did at a work environment, and it was, I think it's very common.
Oh, it's really common. I mean, way more common than you would think, that you would end up with the Mac framework version of Python that's installed with the system, plus the Homebrew version of Python, plus the conda Python, plus an active state Python, plus, name 5 other ways you can install Python. And I guess that's if you really want to kind of get down to the root of what solves some of these problems, is thinking about the Zen of Python. And so I think hopefully a lot of people are aware of the Easter egg built into Python. If you just type Python -m this, you'll get the Zen of Python printed out to you. And part of it is beautiful is better than ugly, but also simple is better than complex.
Yeah.
So what is the simplest way that a user, a programmer, or someone new to Python can get started without having to deal with the headache of all these choices? And there's no shortage of choices. There's no shortage of like web frameworks. There's no shortage of, packaging technologies. There's no shortage of ways to install dependencies. And I think that's where a lot of people just throw up their hands and are like, oh, I can't believe, how hard it is to get someone else to maybe get my code installed and try it out when it's working on my machine. Well, it only worked on your machine because, the wind was blowing in the right direction that time when you installed like from Conda that happened to use the wrong Python. It's again, can get really, really complicated. And it's not obvious because it's not always like clear which Python you're using. So unless you've got a good handle on like understanding your path or understanding virtual environments or syspath and all these other kinds of, deeper in the weeds things that most beginners could care less about.
Right.
They just want to code some Python.
Right. Somebody said at work, we thought you could move from Excel and start doing things in Python. So just start doing it.
Yeah. Which is true if you got enough of the bootstrap basics down so that I think the dream would be I make a folder and I throw main.py in there and I start coding and I am, and I'm productive. But the reality is you may not have even Python installed. Luckily, for Linux machine, if you're on Mac, you're going to have a default system Linux that's going to be there. But, user be warned, do not touch that Python. Do not install anything to that Python. Do not use that Python for anything. Yeah. Because it's really there for the system. That is not your Python. And I think a lot of folks start there and they end up with a mess. That is the first step, like the first tripwire you will come across that'll lead you into disaster. I'm
excited that Apple has finally decided in the latest beta for Mac OS, and I guess it'll be 13.4. I'm not sure of the number, but they're going to remove Python
finally.
7. Yeah. Again, they had talked about it years ago, at least a year and a half ago that I'd heard about it kind of finally going away. And yeah, and you're right that it's one that came installed and it was for the operating system and some other kind of system utilities to do certain things, but it wasn't really intended for you to use. But if a Mac user opened up a terminal and they typed Python, that's what came up. And so that's where this sort of confusion happened a lot with Python and Python 3 and so forth. So maybe we could start with some advice then, like where do you suggest someone to install Python? I guess it will depend on the operating system a little bit.
Well, that's actually what I was going to start with. It was depending on the operating system, and I try to keep things as cross-platform as possible. I actually move between, Mac OS and Linux pretty regular. I rarely touch Windows unless someone's asking me for help.
Okay.
But I try to find a technique that I can use the same way across all those systems. Like, for example, on my Linux machine, I actually use Homebrew to match my Mac experience. So most of the tooling and things I install, just like I would install them on a Mac, I do the same thing on Linux. So I recommend to folks to check out Homebrew because, apt can be tricky for new people, but Homebrew is nice because it follows one of my major rules, which is you should not be using sudo or root privileges or administrator accounts to install any of these things. So that's like kind of the base level starting point.
Maybe we could do a quick diversion into it. And again, we'll shoot toward the total beginner. Maybe they don't even know what sudo is.
Yeah, and they may not know what it is, but they may be using it because they copied and pasted some install thing off the
Stack
off the
Overflow has suggested I just copy and paste this into my terminal.
Right. Well, if it has the word sudo in there, please stop. Take pause as you should, because really you shouldn't need to be using sudo. If you're using Homebrew on Mac or Linux, and actually on Windows they have an equivalent called Chocolatey, which my Windows friends seem to rave about, and it has basically the same gist. Like it's a way to install other programs you would use in the course of your work. I recommend starting there because you can install Homebrew. I believe you can even install it without needing any root privileges. You may need it because I think it puts it on Mac, it puts it in user local. Then on Linux, it puts it into a new home directory for a new user that you can actually share amongst other users on the same system. Way advanced topic we probably won't get into or talk about.
Sure.
But from that point on, you're just going to brew install pyenv, brew install Python, brew install, whatever tools you may need or dependencies that, whatever project you're working on may use. Now, I don't recommend the brew installing of Python directly either. That Python is typically in there as a dependency for other apps you may install from brew.
Okay.
And so if you're going to install a Python on your local system, and we're not talking about containers yet with Docker and things like that, I recommend getting pyenv. It's pyenv, not to be confused with pipenv and some other, like, there's so many similarly sounding things. But pyenv is the way to get a Python onto your system that is yours, and you can play with, and you can mess with, and you can blow it away, and you can reinstall it, and you can get exactly the versions you need. Because you mentioned already, like Python 2.7, well, that's old and ancient stuff, but you may have a project you run across where that's what you need. You shouldn't be using it, but hopefully you're moving forward to like 3 at some point.
Right.
You may have projects where you want to try out the latest and greatest, like 3.10, but you may have projects that are a little more stable, and you're on 3.8 and 3.9, and you don't want to rock the boat and actually be doing development against a slightly different minor version of Python, because it could have just unintended consequences, or you could start using features of that version of Python that's newer that aren't available in your target deployment environment. So pyenv lets me install the specific version that matches wherever I'm going to deploy this to. So if I'm putting it on some machine somewhere else or in somebody else's environment, first question you probably want to ask them is, what version of Python should I target for this application? And if it's your own stuff, I'd recommend going for like latest 3.10.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with starting with 3.10. I have looked at pyenv and played with it a little bit. From what I understand, it is primarily Mac OS and Linux based.
Yeah, there's a Windows
fork,
workaround. Right? Yeah,
okay.
There's like a Windows workaround to be able to use it. I'm less experienced on the Windows side, but I know there are ways to do it. The kind of next step of consistency and probably getting things simpler once you can get your head wrapped around an extra layer of tooling is going to be using things like Docker containers to work and write your code. So if you really truly want to be portable, where you don't care if it's a Windows person, a Mac person, or a Linux person, a Docker image will run on all those environments exactly the same, because typically they're going to run on Windows. It's going to run using WSL2, which is like an Ubuntu Linux kernel. On Mac, it's going to have I can't remember what the virtualization hypervisor is going to run some Ubuntu VM to run that Docker container in, and then on Linux, it's going to run natively, typically on the kernel you've got available to you. So it kind of levels that playing field from what version of Python and how it's all going to interact to just using that bundled version of the image, and then you can now make your code. Simple Docker file of like 3-4 lines really can get you started. In the talk I did at DjangoCon at the very end, I showed off using a Docker file to do some simple development. And I'm actually giving this talk again at PyCon in Salt Lake City coming up here end of April, beginning of May. And I'm going to change the talk up a bit to talk more about images and containers, because I think that's an easy way for, once I've gone beyond being a solo developer on a thing I'm building, and I've got someone else I want to share it with or use it with, this now makes sure that they have the same experience I have in developing, so I can be effective at helping them. They don't run into all the weirdness kind of problems, because that's almost the most isolated way you can run some kind of Python code, is because I'm running it in that container. And unless I've done something really special, it's not breaking outside that container to do anything. It's definitely not bringing in dependencies from outside my container to run.
Yeah, I think about, I don't know, this brings up a whole bunch of things. We have talked about Docker off and on the show. I had Itamar Turner-Trowing on the show, and he's kind of made that a bit of a specialty.
Oh, yeah.
Talks a lot about optimizing the containers and things like that. And so I'll include links to those kind of resources.
Definitely. His material is great.
Yeah. And one of the things that I think is kind of interesting about Docker generally is that phrase you hear as a joke or almost a meme in the developer community that works on my machine.
Yeah, totally.
Type of thing. It's really not a machine then per se. You're kind of sharing this container, which has all the development machine environmental things all kind of combined, right?
It really depends. The container, and that really depends. The container is just a packaging technology, and you can package as much as you want into that container or as little as you want into that container, knowing that it's going to run as a Linux container inside of if you got an Ubuntu system and you're running Docker, you can have a very minimal, I think they've even got base images that have almost nothing in them.
Okay.
Because you have so little dependencies in your package to run on. So if you're running Python, you can use there's slim, you'll see tags out there for these Docker images, for base images that are slim. And those remove just a lot of unneeded dependencies out of that container to make your image smaller. And also there's less attack surface for attack vectors because you don't have all this additional software installed in that container that maybe you're not using. You only really need installed into that container the software you are going to actually use. Now, it is possible to install or ship inside of an image all of the binaries for a whole OS. So if you wanted all of Ubuntu available to you and you wanted to just launch a bash shell and start running commands that are on any Ubuntu machine, you can do that. You don't need it. That's going to be definitely a way bloated approach to shipping your piece of software out to someone. Typically, you want to only have in that container the necessary bits to run your Python code. So it's going to be the Python interpreter and any dependencies the Python interpreter would have, as far as libraries on the system, which are relatively small. I mean, if you look at those slim images, they're in tens of megabytes sometimes.
Right. And the things that it's removing are the things that would make it a complete operating system in some ways. We went down a really weird path once at a job I was on where our code was sort of tied to Windows.
Yeah.
And so we tried to do a Windows Docker container, and it was really hard to find a container that, at the time was properly running it and then the size of it. And it was really kind of a weird task because it seems like for whatever reason, those slim containers, they've been able to really excise it down to just what you need. And then in those cases, the containers you're talking about would have the Python installation would be there already.
Correct. Like you would use typically you'd want to use one of the official base Python images. And depending on your needs, again, taking the slimmest one you can possibly use. And for most folks, it's probably going to be really small. I mean, if you're just running like a Flask app for an API or Django even, you don't have a lot of dependencies on C libraries that would be in the full operating system.
Okay.
I mean, unless you're doing image conversion and you needed to have some kind of C library available that some Python piece is wrapping around, you can get away with a very, very small image.
Okay. So that would be something that you might run into if you're needing like MPEG or something like that, or...
But yeah, if you're doing like some video conversion or anything like that. I mean, that's another power tool of Python is being able to reach out and use other C libraries and easily wrap around them. But it may not be obvious to you as maybe a new person to Python that you are even doing that, because Python does make it very easy. If you just install, you pip install Pillow for doing like image manipulation,
right?
You're going to need to have some C stuff installed to support that.
Yeah, that's something that you kind of wake up to. Even, I had my own experiences in just updating my computer to the latest OS where it broke things, like it no longer had the certifications installed just by me moving to whatever the latest Mojave, is that the new one, the latest OS?
Oh, right. Yeah, because all the package signing is all new.
Yeah. And so it's just like, oh, you can't do this anymore. And I was like, oh, okay. Well, and I know how to fix that. Like I've solved that before, but in a similar way, like I lost other things, like my version of Homebrew broke.
Oh, well, yeah. And again, that's an area where just stick, and it's funny, we've talked for 18 minutes or almost 20 minutes.
Yeah.
And we've not even talked about installing a Python package yet. Just talking about getting a base Python installed. But I've had that problem where the Homebrew installed versions of Python that I then in turn use to make virtual environments for my various projects. Like after an update and I run Homebrew update, all that stuff's broken. Like it's just the wrong libs are not there in the right places anymore, and it's really kind of a pain to deal with, which is another reason I really like the approach of using pyenv to install any base Python that I would use locally. And then pyenv has some nice plugins. With pyenv, you can use the virtualenv plugin and make virtualenvs that pyenv's aware of. For example, there's some nice functionality when you've got a Python version specified in a project. As you cd into that directory, pyenv will pick up the fact that, oh, I should now be using this virtual env or this version of Python instead of the global one. And as a new user and not wanting to have to think too much or think too hard about switching, virtual environments, because that's another thing that trips people up, is if I create a virtual env, like maybe I did Python -m venv, and I made a virtual env inside of wherever I'm sitting right now.
Right.
I have to remember to either activate it or use that Python explicitly in my path so that I'm using that specific sandbox.
Right. You even hit that as a stumbling block in your own video.
Yeah, you're right. I did, and it was kind of a perfect example of that.
Yeah.
Illustrating that point. But with pyenv, having that directory aware virtual environments is super handy. Just to make that part of the problem go away, so that I know when I'm sitting in the right place, I'm getting the right Python for my right project, and when I go someplace else, I'll get all the different dependencies because I'm in the right directory over there.
It's interesting because, like you're saying, like if you were sitting down a brand new user, that might not be an obvious choice.
No, it would not.
I think a lot of resources would probably say, "Oh, go to python.org and download it." And we haven't even touched on data science, which is a whole other ball of environments. And I find that interesting because, like, I played with pyenv. I did like that concept of going into a directory and it being aware. That was really nice. And not only that you can kind of pin not only the virtual environment, which has all of the packages and things that you're using along with it, which we'll talk about much more, but also a version of Python that is like, use a local command, right? That says for this directory, I want to use Python, whatever. It's going to be 3.9 for this particular project or what have you.
Yep, exactly.
ScoutAPM is an application performance monitoring tool designed to help developers find and fix performance issues quickly. With an intuitive user interface, Scout will tie bottlenecks to source code, so you can quickly pinpoint and resolve performance abnormalities, like N+1 queries, slow database queries, and memory bloat. Scout has recently implemented external service monitoring, adding even more granularity when it comes to HTTP requests and API calls. Give Scout a try today with a free 14-day trial by experiencing firsthand why developers worldwide call Scout their best friend. Get your free trial at ScoutAPM.com. Along with that, it's kind of interesting because you switched over because you were kind of talking about in 2019 pipenv.
I was. You're right.
And I kind of went through that myself when I was just starting 2018, 2019. And I was following along on a particular Django book, and then he was really using those commands and locking and doing lock files and stuff that were part of the pipenv thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then the I don't know what happened. It just kind of like the support kind of got really wonky for pipenv, and then it seems like it's kind of come back with the Python Packaging Authority kind of taking it over, and so
yeah, it got taken over and put underneath their repository. I was a huge fan of pipenv when that first released because it did solve a lot of problems nicely for new developers. So when you pipenv installed something, it added it to your basically the equivalent of your requirements file, and it added a hash.
Yeah.
So that if you needed to recreate that environment again, you were one command away from having the exact same setup you had 6 months ago, having it today, or having someone else check it out and be able to get a somewhat repeatable environment because of that. But it was kind of unfortunate. I don't know. I don't know if you go and read all the commits and issues and GitHub stuff and drama around it.
You can dig in if you want.
Yeah, you can dig in if you want, but that wasn't the real reason we stopped using it. It was maybe because of the lack of kind of support and maintenance. The resolver started getting really slow.
Oh, okay.
If you had a project with lots of dependencies, you could be waiting a bit for pipenv to figure out what versions of these things it needed.
Okay.
That problem hasn't necessarily gone away. I don't think it's gone away with pipenv, but other tooling has some similar problems. So you've probably, if you've been following along with pip, there's been some breaking changes recently as they've been moving to the new modern resolver in pip, and it's bitten us a couple times. Actually, 2 weeks ago with the latest release of pip there was a breaking change for a lot of things we do. But in the end, this is another tool I talk about, and I use this tool whether I'm using the Docker containers or whether I'm using pyenv locally on my own machine with virtual envs. But piptools is an amazing package for managing your dependencies, and it has its own built-in resolver. Well, it uses its own resolver. So when you build a requirements file using piptools, when piptools compile specifically, you get a lot of control, kind of power user level control over generating hashes or whether you want all the leaf dependencies or don't. And so that control also gives you basically a file of your requirements. But maybe so for example, if your project had requests as a dependency, which is very common.
Yeah.
Requests itself has it's like 6 or 7 dependencies, depending on which version of requests you've installed. Well, in your requirements file, you may only put requests. And when you pip install -r my requirements.txt, it's going to bring in the 7 other dependencies that are needed.
Right.
What we typically do is we'll have, for just a convention's sake, we'll have a requirements.in file that has requests in it.
Okay.
And then we use piptools compile to build our requests.txt file, which has the full hashes and all the dependencies fully listed out, fully resolved, ready to go.
Okay.
So that when I go to my other machine or into my container and I want to install all those dependencies, I can actually disable pip's dependency resolver altogether. I'll just say, you install what this file says, and kind of like the I know what I'm doing mode. And it goes a lot faster because then it's not doing a lot of checks on the backside to figure out what dependencies are needed to satisfy some root dependency in that file.
Okay, so that's something, and I mentioned this kind of before we started, that I hadn't seen this, and it's something that I'm learning more about just by kind of looking through documentation and especially looking at piptools, and then your talk, you were using it for the Django Con talk. Let me just start. Give a quick background. I'm guessing a lot of people have used pip, which is the Python, installer for packages. When you've installed several packages, there's a way to freeze those basically requirements, the things that another person would need to, or you would need to recreate, this environment that would have all of the installed packages you need to get going.
Mm-hmm.
And you'd save them in a requirements.txt text file. And those generally would have the names of the requirements, what pip's going to use to reinstall them, and then it would usually have like a equals and then a version number
right
in there. And you can kind of do some interesting stuff with that. And I have resources if people want to learn more about how you can kind of control I want to have only up to this version or what have you. But sometimes that requirements, that freezing can be overly verbose and add every single thing. Like you said, I just need requests and I need it to be this version. I'm not so concerned about the additional items that request is going to require. And pip will go and resolve and find the other items it needs. And so when you started to talk about this idea of requirements.in or in file, which is still a text file, but it's being approached differently, does that file have just the primary items that you are looking for? Like I want the request library, and then the .txt file has the actual hashes of the versions that you want that are specifically pinned to, this version that I want, or I guess locked to this version I want.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. So with that in file, you get to express your preferences. If you have a preference for a minimum version for a specific package, but you don't care about the maximum,
okay,
which actually, or you may have a range. Like maybe you're not ready to take the next major version of a dependency, but you're okay taking any minor revision in between.
Okay,
you would express that dependency in your in file. And then any sub-dependencies of that dependency, if the library maintainer, did a good job of packaging that package, they will have in their setup.py, what their ranges of their dependencies are.
Okay.
And so I want to make sure, and this is another problem with pip freeze specifically. If you pip freeze, a week ago, and then you pip installed requests again today, you may get different versions of those dependencies because they're also moving targets.
Yeah.
And the requests library itself is fine with, up to a certain version of this or at least a certain version of that. And I don't want to pick up those security fixes and minor revision changes for those leaf dependencies. I want to be able to make sure I get those rolled into my work as I'm moving my package forward or whatever project I'm working on.
Okay.
And not be locked back in this like kind of prehistoric age. So it's combining the need for repeatable builds, but also staying up to date on minor revisions and security patches and performance updates.
Okay.
That I think piptools compile, being able to specify like what my preference is, and then having piptools compile always build a new requirements.txt file every time I run a compile gets me both those needs satisfied. So at any point in time, I can always go back to a version of that requirements.txt file and get exactly that version with exactly those hashes. And if nothing if some of those things or some part of that does not match up, it'll warn me, or I'll get an error, or it won't finish compiling. So at least I'll be aware I'm not getting what I thought I should be getting. And at the same time, if I get the most current version, and so for example, security and supply chain in Python packages has been an issue in the news probably for the last year and a half.
Yeah, I've had a couple people on talking about it. So
one of the things you can do is, for example, if you're running a Python package, you could use a tool like safety, from the PyUp folks, but have a scheduled weekly CI job that runs safety against your requirements files. And if it fails, like because maybe there's some CVE that has come up in the last week, you could have it rebuild or recompile your requirements.txt file, automatically rerun your test suite, and if it all passes, you could actually re-release a new version of that image or container. So you can automate staying on top of very minor security fixes, typically don't affect the running of your program. Like they shouldn't change an API in a breaking way,
okay,
but you want to make sure you have those security fixes baked into your product or your deployment as soon as you possibly can.
Yeah, it has been such a theme thinking about your own sort of software supply chain.
Yeah.
And the last conversation I had, just even on the last month, we were talking about Brett Cannon had a PEP that was trying to figure out a way to standardize lock files.
Yeah.
And it got, they didn't decide to accept it. And so it's still like, as we have already discussed, there's lots of kind of tools to kind of look at this. And so it's nice to kind of, all right, well, here's some advice. Here's some ways to kind of look at it. Brett did mention piptools also when we talked, that's what he mainly uses. He primarily has, whatever version of Python installed on his particular project, and then just creates virtual environments, in the directories as he kind of goes. When you use a tool like pyenv, does it behave well with like integrated development environment? Does it seem to mind, and is it able to find the versions of your Python that it's supposed to be running everything from?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I'm a PyCharm user primarily, but I know we're trying to support also users on VS Code in our own consulting company.
Okay.
And so when you go to choose whatever interpreter for this project, or it may even pick it up based on the .python version file that was put at the root of your project.
Okay.
It should pick that up. And it'll be aware of all the Pythons that are, in its path or anywhere in its path, because pyenv does some path manipulation to make those things visible to your terminal or your IDE. So it's easy to switch between them.
Okay, cool.
Which is super nice. And then a lot of the IDEs are also very aware of Docker containers. So if I've got an image either running locally or even remotely, I could have a Docker or a Kubernetes, Minikube running on another machine someplace. With PyCharm and VS Code, I can set up that as my Python interpreter. And when I hit the run button in my IDE, it actually like ships that stuff up into that container basically and runs that wherever it's at.
Do you have any resources for someone wanting to learn more about that or use that, or tutorials that you've seen that would be good? I mean, you don't necessarily have to call them out of your head right now, but we could share them in the notes later.
There's still a lot kind of developing there. So I don't know if I have any resources off the top of my head for sure. I look around. We're working a lot right now at 6 Feet Up on the developer experience.
Yeah.
making a kind of a maximum efficiency, just power user. Not, maybe power user is the wrong word. You don't have to be a power user to have a good developer experience.
Right.
I think you just have the right tools sitting at your fingertips so that they're accessible and easy for you to use.
Yeah, maybe you're not like a encumbered user or something. You're able to just not think about it and able to just work,
Which that's the goal, right? Is if you just get, I love this goal. I think I may have mentioned this in the past, where if I ordered a new Mac and it got shipped to my house,
sure,
from the time I broke the plastic on the box and opened it up to the time I'm actually writing code and deploying, it would be nice if that is like measured in hours or hour,
right?
As opposed to sometimes it could be days getting things set up, from VPN clients to IDEs to all the dependencies that you would need to get started on a project, where I just want to git clone. Maybe I have we've been using makefiles in a lot of our projects to help ease getting things started. So I may just, git clone my repo, and then I just run make up, and it builds the container locally, and then starts up the Django instance, starts up the database, starts up Redis, and I'm developing a way, and I didn't have to think about installing Redis or Postgres or running the migrations, because the makeup command just handled that as part of the dependencies of bringing up the Docker Compose bits or whatever, and as part of the environment.
So and I'm guessing this is something that's happening for you right now with probably remote workers. If you hired somebody new, one of the first things you would have them do is, you sent them a Mac laptop, would be to install the Docker tools and then a code editor. And then potentially you would just send them to a Git repo that they could clone and just get started.
Yeah.
From there. Okay.
Yeah. And speeding up that build process also includes things like having a container registry available in that project. So when they authenticate to whatever cloud provider the project's being deployed into, or whatever CI environment is doing the builds, and now they can pull down a pre-built last known good version of that image and use that as the base for them building their own locally. So then it even speeds up that build process further, from maybe it takes a minute or two for them to build the initial image. Now they can get that initial image up and running in tens of seconds.
Well, it really sounds like you've shifted over to this environment. That sounds great.
Well, it seems, and right now we're looking a little more seriously at Kubernetes,
okay,
and being able to support a developer who has to run a large stack of software to be able to make a feature change. And a lot of enterprises or orgs have moved to maybe microservices, or they're using lots of different services in their application, whether they're open source or not. But you can generally, for most of those services, install a local copy of it. For example, if you were working on a project and you had, I mentioned this before, like a Django container, maybe you've got a Node Express container that's running the front end, and you've got Redis and Postgres. Maybe you're using Keycloak for authentication, so you're running a local Keycloak instance. Maybe you're running Elasticache for doing some kind of search, so you got to run that container as well. Those can really start to stack up as far as like system resource usage.
Yeah.
And instead of buying a developer with a Mac with 64 gigabytes of RAM that costs like $5,000, maybe you buy them the entry level MacBook Pro at like $2,000, but then they have another machine either in the cloud or under their desk that's a little less expensive, but has lots of memory and lots of CPU, and can actually run a Minikube Kubernetes cluster, so they can actually use that as where their containers actually run while they're developing. So you develop locally, but actually the code runs on this little larger, beefier machine someplace else. Or you could even share that resource amongst numerous developers.
And in some ways that not very far remote setup.
Yeah, exactly.
It's fairly local, but like it's going to mirror more of a distributed setup too, in some ways.
Exactly.
As opposed to how local setup feels often fictitious in the way that the addressing and stuff can kind of be confusing.
Exactly. And you may debug and find edge cases before they ever go to your QA or dev environment, because your environment locally looks more like what you're releasing it to.
Yeah, what would be deployed out there potentially. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
This week, I want to shine a spotlight on another Real Python video course. The tool this course covers is one that we mentioned in this week's episode. If you thought about the complexity of managing several installations of Python, then this course might be the answer. It's titled Start Managing Multiple Python Versions with pyenv. The course is based on an article by Logan Jones, and in the lessons, Johan Virgier takes you through how to install multiple versions of Python, including the latest development version, how to switch between these installed versions, and how to set up virtual environments using pyenv, and how to activate those different Python versions and virtual environments automatically just by selecting a directory. Managing multiple versions of Python is something that you will probably experience as you grow as a developer, and it doesn't have to be confusing if you use a tool like pyenv. Like most of the video courses on Real Python, the course is broken into easily consumable sections. You set up multiple examples with the techniques shown, and all courses have a transcript including closed captions. Check out the video course. You can find a link in the show notes, or you can find it using the search tool on realpython.com.
Well, there's a bunch of stuff that I want to talk about that's from your talks. And so we're going to kind of maybe skip forward into them. You showed off a tool called pipx, so yet another thing with pip in its name,
Right.
which I don't know how associated pipx is with it, but maybe you can explain what it is and how you like to use it.
So again, one of my favorite tools, and the naming is obviously confusing to folks maybe who are new, but pipx manages building these virtual envs and putting things into your path, but not for the project you're working on. It may be for a tool you need.
Yeah.
So for example, a couple tools we use here at 6 Feet Up are like Black and isort. I also love using bpytop for doing kind of a replacement for glances to see like what's going on in my system. But those are all just like utilities I'm going to run from the command line. So I may just type Black and expect to have that in my path, or my editor may expect it to be in my path.
Yeah.
But how do you install Black? I mean, you can pip install Black, but then what virtual environment is it going into? Is that going to be in my path? So if I just run it from the command line, do I have to like modify my path to make that all work? All of that complexity is basically pushed out of the way by pipx. If you brew install pipx, so that works on Mac Linux, and if you have the Windows version of Chocolatey,
yeah,
pipx will now be available to you in your path, like because it got installed into that package management system. And probably many package managers have pipx available there too, but brew is probably the easiest way to get started. And then from that point, there's one more command it'll tell you to run. Like you run pipx, install pipx, and it'll be like, you need to make sure you run pipx ensure path, which basically puts some bits into your RC and profile dot files. And once you've got those bits in your dot file, you can now run pipx install Black. And now it's going to, behind the scenes in like a hidden directory in your home directory, create a Black virtual environment folder, install Black and any needed dependencies, and then add the Black command or script to your path. So when you just type Black from the command line, it runs Black as you expect.
So you get that full-on command line interface application running, ready to go.
And you can install multiple versions. So if you want to have different versions of different tools. Another nice thing is maybe you've got another one I use regularly is Markdown, like the Python Markdown package, to generate some HTML. But maybe I want to have pigments installed into that virtual environment so that I can colorize some text in my Markdown. You can actually have pipx install the Markdown package, and then you can inject the pigments package into it. And then that's all in that virtual environment, that one sandbox for the Markdown package. And you can have a separate pigments install in pipx, which gives you a dedicated pigments that's not any way linked or related to the one you just installed into your Markdown environment.
Yeah, it sounds like a neat way to try out a lot of these things too.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's easy to keep them all up to date. So if you've got like, maybe I got isort, Black, bpytop, Markdown, and pigments all installed. If I want to make sure they're all up to date, I can literally run pipx upgrade all.
Okay.
And it'll go through each one of them individually and upgrade all the packages, kind of like you do like an app upgrade or apt update, apt upgrade.
Yeah.
pipx has similar commands for that. Another thing I use it for is keeping up to date on the latest versions of tools like Docker Compose. So you can install the Docker desktop and it's going to install a version of Docker Compose, but it may not be the latest, so you may not have all the bug fixes. But Docker Compose is just a Python package in PyPy. So you can pipx install Docker Compose, and you've got the latest version. Pipx puts it in your path, so your editor, your PyCharm or your VS Code is going to be aware of this latest version of Docker Compose.
Oh, cool. That's nice.
Yeah, it's super nice.
What was the one called? btop, or what was it again?
bpytop.
bpytop. Okay.
Yeah. So a couple weeks ago, by the time you hear this, I was on Python Bytes with Michael Kennedy, and we talked about bpytop. It's an awesome package.
Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of, if you ever type top in your Linux terminal or your Mac terminal, you'll see all the running processes. You'll see some, memory stats, like how much free and how much used. You'll see the system load, like, the 1 minute, 5 minute, 15-minute loads. That's all good and all, but it's basic. If you really want the fancy, tricked out, like awesome experience, pipx install bpytop, and then just run bpytop, and you're going to get beautiful trending graphs of CPU usage and network usage. And it's all colored. It's all in your terminal, but it is just gorgeous way to look at your system. And it gives you just stats on specific processes, like CPUs, each individual CPU core. You can get, per network interface traffic stats, IO stats. So if you're really looking, if you've got some kind of performance problem with an app, you can log into a remote server, just install bpytop, and just sit and watch and wonder and look at like all the things that are kind of going on. So
you'd have that just running in a terminal window,
yep,
and then running, your other commands and maybe a separate one, watching the performance.
Yeah, because not everybody has maybe the luxury of having full Prometheus and Grafana graphs for every system they got under their control. This is like a real-time, nice way to quick and dirty jump on a machine and see if you can identify a bottleneck.
All right.
Or just marvel at the beautifulness of the text-based.
Well, that's what that's what intrigued me on it when he showed it and then didn't talk about it. I was like, oh, wait, what was that? It flew by. So the other area I wanted to talk about briefly is, and I mentioned at the top, is kind of going portable and not taking a laptop, but potentially taking an iPad with you. And I already mentioned that David Amos wrote an article that I'll link to, which is really great. It's basically how to run Python on an iPad. And he has some different suggestions. And I think I'll mention a couple of the ones that he talks about. He mentions a tool called A-shell. And it's, kind of like having a terminal on your iPad, but it does come with an installation of Python 3.9, so you can actually run scripts and other things inside of it. I haven't run it yet. I'm going to kind of go and play with it soon. That same developer makes another tool that is for doing notebooks. There's a bunch of really great resources in his article. The tool for doing notebooks is called Carnets, Carnets. There's two versions of that. One that has SciPy included. So if you want to run notebooks on your iPad, you could do that. And then your talk was like a lightning talk that would just kind of touched on a bunch of stuff about, hey, if you're going to go on the road and do stuff, and you mentioned a bunch of tools, and unfortunately some of the tools have disappeared, but
yeah, I know.
You already mentioned like Pythonista you mentioned, and
which that's still valid and good.
It does still work. Okay, cool.
It does, yeah. I actually literally just opened it up to make sure, so I wouldn't be telling anybody stories out of school.
That's a neat one.
But Pythonista is really cool. I mean, if you need to run some quick scripts, Pythonista comes with a bunch of modules, kind of opinionated modules already installed. So if you need a MySQL client,
there's like a Pygame-ish one and stuff.
There's a MySQL client. There's requests is already installed. I think it even has Flask installed. So you can do quite a bit just with Pythonista, and you can actually open up Python files from the new file system. I think with iOS,
that has helped it so much.
Yeah, with that 13, when they introduced that kind of not shared, but there's a real file system that you can get to.
Yeah, and you can get to services, not only the iCloud stuff or what's stored on the iPad, but you can, I guess, I don't use Dropbox in this way, but you could use that, or I don't know, do you use a particular file server?
I use OneDrive typically. Okay, because we're kind of an Office 365. Yeah, we're an Office 365, and there's actually a really nice open source OneDrive client for Linux that I use to basically synchronize my documents folder from my Linux machine to OneDrive, and now I've got them available on my iPad.
Yeah,
because I don't like carrying a giant laptop with me when I travel, so I only take the iPad with me, knowing I've got access to Git, because there's good Git clients for iPad, so you can pull out code. And I've got access to all the documents.
Yeah, I wanted to mention that one. You're still using Working Copy, which is a really kind of cool Git tool for iPad.
Yeah, and it's got nice diffs, and you can clone into your file system and pull things out. One new thing that has just come out, well, not new, but there's a new release of the terminal I've been using for the iPad called Blink.
Okay.
And if you are a total like power user hacker, Blink is definitely the terminal you want to look into.
Okay.
It's got great support for all the crazy fonts and font ligatures and the fancy characters and all those kinds of things, but it's also pretty hackable. I think the project is I think there's an open source component to it, and so if you wanted to install Python into it, you can. It doesn't out of the box come with Python, but it does come with some minimal Linux shell utilities and tools.
Okay.
And it also includes, they have a new web UI, web viewer built into Blink. But what that means is you can just from the Blink prompt type code, and it launches the cloud version of VS Code locally.
Oh, all right.
On the iPad. And if you've got a code space set up, with Microsoft on GitHub, you can actually run your Python code that you're coding in real VS Code on your iPad and run that code in a container over on Codespaces.
Wow, that's cool.
So like the sky's the limit at that point. You've got not every VS Code extension is accessible for the web version of Codespaces, but the ones that are all available to you on the iPad.
Okay.
And it works great. I've got a keyboard and mouse hooked up to my iPad, and when I'm traveling, I literally take a 40% mechanical keyboard in my bag with me everywhere I go, so that I have that at all the times with my iPad.
Okay, so it's literally just the set of keys with maybe Control and Shift and Command.
I daily drive on a 40% too.
Oh, wow. Okay. I feel like I'd be missing out. Like, I guess it's missing all the function keys, or does it have a key command?
No, but there's alternate commands. Like there's two functions to access like all the function keys and the numbers, and then like all the media keys are there, and I can adjust the brightness on the screen.
At least you get an escape, right?
It's all there. Yeah, as long as that was the main thing. It's got a real escape key.
Yeah,
that's actually literally why I started using Linux as my primary desktop.
Okay. Yeah, and then I mentioned some tools with a previous guest. We were talking about devdocs.io, and that's a website that you could visit and then potentially download them in the browser and have them, if you were traveling and turn on airplane mode, it would still have those documents with you. Did you have a different documentation tool?
Yeah.
I know you had mentioned Dash back then, but he decided not to update it.
Yeah, I'd mentioned Dash, which is kind of unfortunate it's not updated for iOS. On Linux and on Windows, there's a Dash clone called Zeal.
Okay.
That I use for documentation, but I'm going to have to go find an alternative for my iPad now.
Yeah.
So I may have to check out the one you were talking about. It's so nice to be able to have those doc sets available while you're traveling. Because you could be on a plane, and if you've got the full Python docs, all the Django docs, all the Redis docs, all the Postgres docs, I mean, you've pretty much got the wealth of knowledge you need to develop almost any application for the web right there.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
Mm-hmm.
I have these weekly questions I wanted to ask you, and the first one is, what are you excited about in the world of Python?
Well, I'm very excited about the upcoming Python Web Conference.
Yeah.
We are organizing and putting on the 4th annual Python Web Conference. It's coming up end of March, so March 21st through the 25th. We have got 6 tracks. I actually had to update my numbers because we added in an additional track. So it's basically 5 half days, a little over half days, with 6 tracks each day. Keynotes at the beginning and the end of every day. So you're going to have like 12, something like that. They're going to have 10 plus a couple extra bonus ones in there. Keynote speakers every day.
Wow. And
these are some just fantastic people. If you go to pythonwebconf.com, you can see the speakers page. That's probably my favorite page to go to. I go look at it, periodically because there's new people being added. Although it's pretty static right now. We've got everybody's settled, but we've got over 90 speakers who are joining us for this amazing journey. There's going to be a whole track of tutorials. So each day there'll be some long form. Bring your laptop and actually learn and code alongside with the speaker type talks, and then all the speakers for 2 tracks of app dev, a track of cloud, track of PyData, a track for culture. All the topics should be covered there.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah.
You've been doing kind of a bit of preview videos with some of the talks. I thought that was interesting, and maybe you had started that last year too.
We did. So it's kind of neat little teasers, just super quick, like kind of Twitter bite size. Grab a couple speakers. And I've been focusing on maybe not necessarily the most well-known people in the community, trying to shine a light on some of the people who are maybe new to speaking at the conference. So if you saw the one that came out, I think last week, was Natalie Roberts. She's actually local here in Indy. She has spoken at IndyPy in the past, but she's not necessarily like world-renowned like some of the other speakers who maybe are coming to the conference.
Okay.
So I make sure that they get their time and their moment, and then actually they're just all amazing people. So check them out. Those are some cool little teasers. I'm recording a bunch more of them, so look for more of those coming out on Twitter. If you follow Python WebConf on Twitter, I think that's where they're mainly getting released, or you can follow me because I'll probably retweet a lot of them too.
Cool.
Yeah, I think we're looking at almost a 3x increase in attendees so far if we look at our ticket sales right now. So grab your tickets. It should be a lot of fun. It'll be on the Loudswarm platform, which is for the last 2 years, which is where we've done the conference.
Yeah.
Is on that platform we developed. It's running Django, so it's actually delivered in Python.
Yeah. You talked about that quite a bit last year when we were talking about it. That was great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it sounds like a really awesome platform. And again, people sometimes want to go, well, where is Python actually being used? And it's like, well, here you go. Here's a whole conference being hosted via Python, which is great. So, what's something that you want to learn next?
Oh, I was telling you, if we kind of got started, I think I've almost getting ready to declare dot file bankruptcy.
Okay.
I'm running on some old dot files for my machine that I've just carried along for ages and ages and ages. I'm a long time, Vim, ZSH, semi-pseudo power user, depending on who you are in relativity.
Okay.
I may look pretty skilled, or I may look pretty meager, but I think I need to clean that all out and get some kind of better system. Right now, I'm just using a shell script that pulls them off of my GitHub, and I'm checking out a tool called chezmoi, which is like my house in French.
Yeah.
And it's a pretty nice set of tools for templating out all your dot files and basically managing them, having variables for kind of conditionals. If I'm installing onto my Linux machine, it gets this stuff. If I'm installing onto my Mac machine, it gets this stuff.
Okay.
It can actually have some scripts you can run. So my current thing runs a shell script and just installs like my dot files and like symlinks my dot files in the right place. But this new tool I'm looking at called chezmoi, it will actually run, like if I wanted to make sure Brew was installed, I can actually, if I just got a brand new machine out of the box, just install chezmoi and type chezmoi apply, or clone my repo and then chezmoi apply.
Okay.
It should install Brew and get all my nice tools that get the Git version of Git I want and the version NeoVim that I want, and have that all installed and ready to go for me. So I don't have to think too much about getting a new machine ready to go.
So for somebody who's not familiar with it, the dot files are considered that because they're hidden files.
Yeah.
Is there like a specific subset that would be specific for all? You mentioned several different kind of like shell kind of environment things that and sort of settings and things like that. Like what are all included in like a generically defining what are dot files?
Well, and then they're kind of more than just dot files. This chezmoi thing can manage any file in your system, but
sounds like it.
Yeah, but for example, like in a Linux machine, you'll have a .config directory, and inside there you may have like I use Kitty as my terminal of choice because it's cross-platform.
Okay.
And so I have a Kitty conf that maintains like what fonts I like and what key bindings I want to use and all those kinds of special settings and what color theme I want to use. And so chezmoi can actually install the right version of your Kitty conf file, link in like I pull down a Git repository of Kitty themes, and then it can symlink to the correct one for whatever feeling I'm having today, and make sure that stays consistent across all my machines. So it's more than just like maybe your .zsh files or your .profile. There's also your .vimrcs. There's all the like plugins for Vim that you want to have, and so these tools manage all those kind of power user things. So as you start getting like more and more comfortable with like running on the command line, you're going to have preferences about like, I want ls to run this specific way because I want the colorized output and I want maybe little icons or whatever in front of my thing. So I'm going to install pls so I can see a pretty version of ls. So I really love tricking out my machine and making sure that it's like it's mine. I make it mine.
Yeah.
I feel good whenever I launch the terminal, and everything's a couple keystrokes away. And that's like happiness right there.
It's your house.
It is my house. Welcome to my house.
Exactly. That's cool. The idea of it being portable is really crucial too. The idea of that you work across lots of machines, it sounds like, and need to be able to move those things across.
A lot of folks I've met or run into in the community, some of them have a resistance to tricking out their machine. And their reason is, well, if I go to log into some other machine where it's not my computer, I won't have all those shortcuts. And so my muscle memory will be off.
Right.
But my counter to that is you're one command away from pulling your .files onto that machine and a second command from applying them. And now you are completely at home and way more productive than if you didn't have all those tools to start with.
Yeah, sounds great. Yeah, a lot of the things that you were showing in your video of these terminals and these kind of environments, they've definitely shifted over the years because I got a nice survey of them as you went, and they definitely become more graphical. And it's nice because they show lots of stuff. Like in the terminal, it shows you. In the case of pyenv, it's showing the version of Python that's running and which virtual environment are you in, and So
and if you're using nerd fonts, you get all the fancy Python icon or the Git icon for all those kind of segments that are on your prompt.
Yeah.
And it's those niceties, like those visual cues that makes my brain happy. And it gives you more context and information about where you're working. If you had just a standard prompt from whatever machine you were logged into, you wouldn't know maybe what virtual env is active or what version of Python would be active. But if you're using one of these power tool type fonts, like I'm using the bullet train shell prompt, and it gives me extra information. It tells me the status code from the last error, if the last command ended in an error, or it'll tell me if my working directory is dirty for my Git project I'm working on. So I'll know that, there's changed files here. I should probably pay attention, do a git status or whatever, and see what I've changed.
Normally you'd need an IDE or something watching those things for you.
Or you'd have to run a command to see that it...
Right, okay, that too.
Yeah.
Cool, awesome. Yeah, Anthony Shaw wrote a really great article about setting up VS Code, and it went deep into a lot of the things that you're just talking about. So if people are interested in learning more about nerd fonts or customizing the terminal to kind of prettify it goes a deep dive into that stuff. But I'll definitely check out that Kitty thing. Sounds kind of cool to have something that's cross-platform too.
I mean, if you're a developer, why not have a nice, beautiful experience?
Exactly. Make your house nice.
Exactly.
Makes you want to work there.
It does. I mean, it totally does. Like I get up in the morning and I get on my terminal and I'm just like, oh, this is so nice. It's very happy.
Well, Calvin, thanks so much for coming on the show again. It's really great to talk to you.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
Don't forget this week's sponsor, ScoutAPM. Find and fix performance issues with ease at ScoutAPM.com. I want to thank Calvin Hendryx-Parker for coming on the show this week. And I want to thank you for listening to the Real Python Podcast. Make sure that you click that follow button in your podcast player. And if you see a subscribe button somewhere, remember that the Real Python Podcast is free. If you like the show, please leave us a review. You can find show notes with links to all the topics we spoke about inside your podcast player or at realpython.com/podcast. And while you're there, you can leave us a question or a topic idea. I've been your host, Christopher Bailey, and look forward to talking to you soon.